Risk and resilience. I'd like you to think about a case. The case of John and Paul. John and Paul were friends who grew up in the same neighborhood in a relatively large industrial city. Their neighborhood had some of the highest rates of drug use and violence in their city. In addition, both John and Paul had similar family lives. Both of them had parents that typically fought a lot and eventually separated. And they also had siblings that ran into a variety of different behavioral issues or troubles growing up. They both had siblings, for example, that dropped out of school and were incarcerated for drug-related felonies and crimes. Now, looking, let's say, 20 years into the future, maybe 30 years in the future, we find that John has finished high school and has received at least 2 years of training at a local trade school. He now works in a factory and lives with his spouse and 2 children. John has a relatively stable life and is planning to save enough money to support his kids' education, whether that's going to trade school or going to college, whatever they'd like. In comparison, Paul had a different outcome. Looking 30 years in his future, Paul never graduated high school. And over these 30 years, he'd been in and out of prison. Paul is currently unemployed, drinks alcohol excessively on a regular basis. He also has 2 children, but he never sees them or sees them infrequently or rarely. Paul has moved around a lot, but mostly he still lives in the same neighborhood he grew up in. So the question we might ask is, why is it that John and Paul had different outcomes, despite having the same neighborhood, living in the same city, growing up in similar family environments? How is it that John and Paul could have different outcomes? Or more specifically, why is it that some people are able to thrive despite encountering adversity? To answer this question, we have to think about risk and resilience. First, risk factors. You probably already have a general idea of what risk factors are, but formally defined here, they're attributes, characteristics, or exposures to different experiences that increase the likelihood of negative outcomes. So, risk factors are those factors that increase the likelihood of something negative happening in regards to health, adjustment, well-being, behavior, etc. There are some times that we think about risk when we talk about youth. A lot of the times when we talk about youth, we talk about risk factors that they might encounter. In this class, I'm a little hesitant to use the word at risk, and you'll notice every once in a while I'll throw in youth with complex needs. Now, the reason that I say both is because, one, people use at risk, that's the title of the minor, and it's a common term that you've probably been exposed to. But there are some cons, some issues with using the at-risk label. For example, it can create a focus on deficits rather than strengths, focusing on what's problematic or wrong rather than what youth are doing well. It centers the problem on the youth themselves by labeling them as at-risk youth. It creates almost a sense of blame that it's the youth's fault rather than something to do with their social environment. And lastly, often we use at-risk labels in a way that conflates social identities with risk rather than the mechanisms that represent those social identities. For example, we'll say poverty is a risk factor, or, being an incarcerated youth is a risk factor, rather than focusing on why. Why might poverty be a risk factor? So that it's not necessarily poverty that's the risk, but that less access to certain resources or other factors associated with poverty might be the mechanisms behind why we see differences between those that have one experience or one identity compared to another. On the other side of risk is resilience. Now, this also is self-explanatory. When you think of resilience, you probably think of something that is resilient to damage, that despite how much you try to break it or smash it or punch it, it still keeps its shape, something that's a very resilient material. And that's basically how we're using resilience here. It refers to individuals' abilities to successfully adapt to life situations despite social disadvantage or other adverse conditions. So it's an ability for individuals to bounce back after facing a challenge. That despite encountering something negative, that they're able to recover from that negative experience. And that resilience is not necessarily an inherent trait, but something that you learn, that you can develop. It involves behaviors, thoughts, and actions that you can employ, that you can learn, that you can develop over time. Some people start off maybe resilient in some regards, but can also build resiliency in these and other regards as well. So, basic takeaway, resiliency is about adapting to life situations when bad stuff happens. And it's something that you can learn, can be developed. Now, risk and risk factors are typically equated together, and resilience also has its own kind of factor thing associated with it, which is protective factors. And like risk factors that contribute to negative outcomes, protective factors contribute to positive outcomes. These are attributes, characteristics, or other exposures to different experiences that reduce the likelihood of negative outcomes. And there are many types of protective factors out there, but some common ones include the environment you live in, the family that you have, and individual characteristics or personality traits. Thinking about the social environment, protective factors could include things like the peers you have, the school you go to, the community you live in, or the family that's around you. These types of relationships can provide you different sources of support, emotional, appraisal, encouragement, advice, different types of social support that help you when you're struggling. Thinking about your social environment, one specific part of that could also be your family. It could be parents, siblings, or grandparents, or aunts, or uncles, or cousins, or second cousin twice removed. These people can provide you social support as well. They can help you nurture certain life skills. They can model healthy ways of behavior or communication. And they can also provide supervision for certain behaviors, whether it's home, school, or other places. Parents can also have an influence on who you spend time with and how that time is spent. So through various ways, the family system can also act as a protective factor. And lastly, you might also look at protective factors in terms of individual characteristics. So things that you do, things about you and yourself. So your ability to problem solve, your ability to look at the bright side of things, your ability to form relationships and be self-reflective and thoughtful, and even, maybe having a sense of humor and ability to delay gratification. So thinking back to the case study that we went over of John and Paul and why they had different experiences, we might think about their resilience and the factors that they had access to that promoted that resilience. Maybe they were things, aunts and uncles, for example, outside of the family system, the immediate family system, that John or Paul did or did not have access to. A supportive grandparent or a supportive aunt or uncle could have made the difference here. So when we think about why some people are able to thrive despite adversity, one reason is because risk isn't the whole picture, and there are other parts of the story that we might not have seen.